Well, good afternoon to everybody who's here in Germany and elsewhere in Europe. And of course, good morning to those of you who are in the United States. My name's John Emerson. I'm wearing my hat today as the chair of the American Council on Germany. And it is my great pleasure to be able to join with and listen to and chat with my good friend Emily Haber, who is the German ambassador to the United States of America. So Emily, welcome.
Thank you, John. Good to see you.
Yeah, it's great to see you. So this just by way of introduction, this event is part of a series of events that have been organized by the American Council on Germany and the German Embassy in Washington to highlight the issues of the G7 agenda this year. And I think it's pretty fair to say that those maybe have changed somewhat. The G7 at the beginning of the year, I think folks thought would be mostly focused on economic relations, maybe focus on sustainability, promoting economic equality, public health, COVID, those kinds of things. But obviously, after Russian aggression and Putin's war in Ukraine, I think it's safe to say that the agenda has changed to a certain extent. And this is something we'll get into with our special guest today. I also note that the G7 is actually taking place about the end of next week, right, Emily? Yes. In my favorite place in Germany, Schloss Elmau, the place where we actually held the G7 back in 2015 when I was ambassador here. And it's a absolutely wonderful place for this kind of discussion to take place. Now, for Emily. She hardly needs an introduction to you. She's been a frequent interlocutor and guest on these kinds of calls. She is basically, you're celebrating, I guess, your fourth year now as ambassador. And unlike most ambassadors who get pulled back when there's a change of administration, Emily's done such an extraordinary job that she is still here and will continue to be here for a while. So we're all very happy about that. Immediately prior to serving as ambassador, Ambassador Haber was state secretary in the Federal Ministry of the Interior. And before that, and by the way, in that role, she was overseeing security, migration. Think of Homeland Security. That's a very similar for you Americans on the call. In 2009, she was political director of the Foreign Office, which is the number 3 position in the Foreign Ministry. And of course, in 2011, she was state secretary, which is the number 2 position in the foreign ministry. She was the first woman to hold both of those positions. In her foreign service career, Emily was posted to Moscow several times and has extensive knowledge about the Soviet Union and Russia. And so I think her insights into that will be of great interest to us today as well. So Emily, great to welcome you. Thank you for being with us. And why don't we get started? So just let's kick off with sort of what was the big post-war, or not war, because as we know, the war started back in 2015 or 2014, but post-invasion event in Germany, which was Zeitenwende. You know, Germany's foreign and security policy shift that a lot of folks basically noted was effectively jettisoning many years of sacred cows as it related to foreign policy, as it related to Russia, and et cetera. So how has Germany's security policy changed as a result of Putin's invasion of Ukraine?
Look, John, I entered the German Foreign Service in 1982. So I'm at this since 40 years. I don't think that in my lifetime in service, I've seen a greater policy shift than the one that happened after 24th of February. It's obviously with reunification, there were massive shifts too, but they related to the environment mostly. They didn't relate to fundamental principles that informed our foreign policy and security policy and energy policy. And here, as you noted, fundamental pillars have simply broken away. The conviction, for example, that interdependence would produce either alignment or greater stability, which, by the way, it often does, but that rests on the assumption and analysis that both parties share the same cost-benefit analysis. And obviously, in the case of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, which seemed so irrational to so many observers before the war, they didn't think it was going to happen because they thought it was irrational, because it was contradicting any sensible cost-benefit analysis. Well, we didn't share the cost-benefit analysis. For Putin, it was a completely different agenda, a political one, a geopolitical one, informed by a lopsided historical views, and that trumped all other interests or perspectives. What also was pulverized was the notion that after reunification, Germany was only surrounded by friends. We were obviously surrounded only by friends, but the assumption that Russia too would adapt to it, would adapt to a changed landscape without returning to revisionism, was standing on very thin ice, and that ice has broken too. So all of that has led us to rethink interdependence, to rethink vulnerabilities in terms of energy dependence, for example, to rethink security, to rethink reassurance, and to rethink fundamental aspects of our foreign policy, and that's where we are now.
You know, it's interesting. We had a transatlantic conference with the American Council in Germany and Atlantic Brook beginning of last week. And Sigmar Gabriel, who during my time here was Minister of Energy and Economics and was the Vice Chancellor and subsequently became, for a brief period of time, the Foreign Minister of Germany, gave a fairly extraordinary, as the former leader of the Social Democratic Party, very extraordinary opening, welcoming speech where he effectively acknowledged that Wandel durch Handel at the end of the day proved to be wrong, that it was based on assumptions about Russia, about Vladimir Putin. Maybe it worked better during the Cold War, but at this point, those assumptions were proven to be invalid. And he actually said he took personal responsibility for what role he may have played in that. I saw that as pretty extraordinary, even from a former politician to make that kind of admission. I sometimes wish in our country we would see a little bit more of that. But in any event, it sort of begs the question, and you touched on this when you said that Vladimir Putin has this sort of lopsided or wrong-headed view of history, which I assume you're talking about, that Ukraine doesn't deserve to exist as a separate country, that it's really part of Russia, that he wants to make Russia great again, I suppose you could say. But how did we get this so wrong, I guess, just given your experience in Russia and your experience as a diplomat for so many years?
First, let me return to your comment. We are having in Germany right now, as we should, a no-holds-barred discussion on when did it go wrong and how did it go wrong and why did we get our assumptions wrong and what was right about them and what was totally misleading. You see, Handel durch Wandel did work in the past, and I would contend that to some degree the German experience when the GDR broke down, or even with the implosion of the Soviet Union, was linked to seeing that interdependence had produced change, had produced an openness that was actually conducive to more stability and fundamental change in the countries that we sought to interact with. The key takeaway right now is that it only works if you share about the cost-benefit analysis. If other issues come in, if political agendas take over, and that has been the case in Russia, then they're bound to fail. So that's the takeaway right now. It's not a takeaway that fundamentally says interaction produces vulnerabilities. Interaction can produce stability, and we'll have to carefully watch whether we agree on the agendas and on the cost-benefit analysis. So when did we get it wrong? I think it's fair to say that in the early decade of the 2000s, Putin was going out of his way to publicly speak and say things that actually the West wanted to hear. He certainly did in the Bundestag.
Yeah, that big speech. I remember that.
Gave his speech. But an American interlocutor who worked with the administration during the tenure of President Bush, George W. Bush, told me too this observation that for a long time, Putin was keen on trying to transmit to the West a picture of Russia and Russia's intention and Russia's trajectory that the West actually wanted to hear. The turning point, I'd say, came in 2007 when he gave a speech in Munich, certainly with the August war in Georgia in 2008. And after that, the trajectory became pretty clear into one direction: a Russia that was not a status quo power, that was ready to take step after step to weaponize policies. Only, you see, in the German case, they hadn't weaponized energy policies until this year. They had weaponized energy policies in the Georgian war. They had weaponized energy in Southeastern Europe and Ukraine in 2011, and there are other cases too. They added up. But I guess what happened was what often happens in history. You are wedded to perceptions, and you called it holy cows of the past. And it will take fundamental shifts to rethink. That's what's happened after 24th of February in Germany, but not only in Germany, in the rest of Europe too.
Oh, by the way, the rest of the world, in the United States. I mean, my response when I spoke after Sigmar Gabriel, I kind of chucked what I was going to talk about and said, you know, you could argue that the United States made the same mistake vis-a-vis China. Engagement with China was supposed to bring China into the, you know, rules-based order.
Exactly, and would make China somewhat similar to us. That was also one of
exactly.
The
so this is a good. This is an important takeaway. I mean, the importance of really putting ourselves in other people's shoes, and maybe even, you know, I think a lot of times when we see the world in a different way, and your cost-benefit analysis is perfect way to describe it. We just can't imagine that there would be this different perspective, and which is often, you know, a function of the history and all of the particular place. You know, I think when you think about cost-benefit analysis, though, this has to be a terrible setback for Putin. I mean, yes, he's getting a lot of money now as energy prices are up, but, you know, fundamentally, I don't see, given the war crimes that have been committed, I don't see, you know, Russia coming off, being let out of the doghouse of isolation and economic isolation from 2/3 of the global economy anytime soon, regardless of what happens in the, you know, as this war progresses. And, you know, Putin was complaining about NATO. Now he's looking at a chance of doubling the NATO border with Russia, with Finland, obviously. And beyond that, NATO is far more militarized. And it's always been a geopolitical objective of Vladimir Putin to drive a wedge between the United States and Europe, and to drive wedges, you know, amongst and between EU member states. That clearly hasn't happened as everybody's together in a way that, to quote Jens Stoltenberg from the Munich Security Conference, we haven't seen since the immediate aftermath of 9/11. And so I would just think it's cost, at least from a geopolitical standpoint, for sure on this. And one question I don't intend to jump into the questions from our audience yet, but there's one I have to acknowledge, which is from our mutual friend, Jim Melville, who was, of course, Deputy Chief of Mission during my time in Berlin and then became the ambassador to Estonia. And he was wondering asking if you would comment, and I think it's appropriate given what we're talking about right now, on the implications of Finland and Sweden potentially joining NATO. I guess we'll learn more about that in a couple of weeks at the NATO summit. And whether you have any insights into what Erdogan's ultimate objectives are. Is this a speed bump or a serious problem?
Well, let me start by saying this. When Putin entered into the war, he certainly had different war aims. I think when he entered into the war, he wanted a total land grab, a total territorial and political grab. He wanted to decapitate the Ukrainian government, and everyone expected that, and certainly he did, but this would be a matter of days, and none of that happened. So he had to seriously recalibrate the war aims. At the same time, he seems to have assumed that while the West would hit back hard for a while or for a moment, they would reconsider given emerging fissures and given the economic costs. And you alluded to it already. If you look at the entire picture of the Western reactions, really the bulk of it is irreversible. Ukraine will be invited to become a member of the European Union and regain candidateship. Is that reversible? No, it's not. I have no doubt that Finland and Sweden will shortly become members of NATO. I really cannot comment on the calculus of the Turkish president, though I would observe that he's in the midst of a very difficult domestic a situation, including economic hardship, and he's in for elections. I think what is happening right now is it's negotiations, and he's trying to make most of it. Finland and Sweden will become members of NATO. We will not disinvent, given the experience of a war of aggression in our neighborhood, will not disinvent our policy of significantly strengthening the eastern flank and strengthening reassurance. We will not simply disremember what Russia has done. So I see a fundamental shift across the board. And I'm not even talking about Germany and all the shifts we've seen there, sending weapons to conflict and crisis areas if an aggression is in place, setting up a fund of 1 billion euros enshrined in the Constitution, reaching the 2% goal. All of that is irreversible, and it's an effect of the Russian war of aggression. So that is certainly something that Putin had not accepted. So far, I see a great deal, as you've pointed out, of transatlantic unity. As a matter of fact, I would say that this was an extraordinary case of not only alliance management, but also management of countries aligned in the face of an aggression against the territorial integrity and the sovereignty of a democratic country. So that's the effect. That's what Putin has produced, and it will be irreversible.
I'll tell you something else he produced. I mean, Ukraine was a country that many parts of it were actually very, very favorably disposed towards Russia. Many Ukrainians maybe even identified more as Russian than Ukrainian. Boy, that's over. He now, I think multi-generational hatred of Russia from many in Ukraine because of the way he has prosecuted this war. And that's yet another cost that, that's certainly imposed on him.
Oh, let me jump in there, because that's true. But it's also mirrored in what we see across Europe right now. Simply because so many Europeans had not believed that a war would happen in a geography where the memory of another war unleashed by Germany is still a living echo, if you will. It was simply unthinkable to so many that we would see killings and deportations and war crimes in our neighborhood, in Europe, in a region affected by wars. And it sort of was so existential that what Russia will not disinvent, will be able to disinvent either, is the sense in Europe that Russia was able to do it. And that will alter fundamentally the way Russia is being viewed.
Oh, that's interesting. And I love your phrasing, a living echo, because that's absolutely right. So that begs another question, because clearly Vladimir Putin's strategy right now is basically, let's, I'm going to wait you out. Never underestimate the capacity of the Russian people to endure suffering, and also he, of course, is controlling the information that they get about this war. And still has some level of public support for it. And the feckless West, they'll ultimately get tired of this. They'll have elections. Inflation is hurting them. The energy crisis is hurting them. Germany won't like it when, people have to turn down the, thermostat because there isn't enough heating gas. And, until, the replacement for Russian gas, which is probably going to take a couple of years to get to that point. So what's your take on, as you consider with all your experience and also presumably communications with our allies, either based in the United States or fellow ambassadors and all, what's your sense of his ability to wait us out and our ability to stay together?
Well, first, the observation is in place that from the outset, he seemed to have assumed that Russia, that we wouldn't even muster our capacity to adopt severe sanctions that would hit ourselves. He was wrong there. We've passed 6 sanction packages, and the alignment in the EU, the alignment with the United States and the UK and Canada and so forth is overwhelming. And we're not stopping there. We're taking decisions that are going to be very hard, and that's true. And we're going to pay an economic price for that. So far, I don't see any backlash against that. As for him, so far, what we are seeing is really a decoupling of the Russian economy from the West. The sanctions we've adopted will affect their trade, will affect export and import restrictions, will affect oligarchs, will affect the banking system, will affect the capacity to refinance themselves. It will cut them off totally from modern technologies that they require in order to have an economy for the future. So don't underestimate that. The costs of these sanctions may not have happened instantly, though the downturn in the economy is predicted significant. It will be significant, as is the inflation. As predictions have it for the coming year. So they will not feel it instantly, but it will come hard and will isolate them internationally, politically certainly, but also economically. So if the first expectations were the West will not be able to adopt sanctions, they were wrong. And if their assumptions are sanctions will not really hit us until the moment, because the moment is near where the West will reconsider because they're not willing to pay the price, well, I'm saying that's counterfactual.
Good, very good point. Very good point. Before we move to the G7, and we're getting a few questions coming in on that, let me just also get back to what Germany is doing bilaterally. I mean, there's been some criticism of Germany in some quarters of moving too slowly on providing weapons and heavy weapons. I noted that the howitzers just arrived today, and that's a very significant heavy weapon provided by Germany. But can you talk a little bit about what Germany is doing bilaterally, both economically and from the standpoint of providing weapons to Ukraine?
I noticed that after the 24th of February, first, the reactions to the decisions the Chancellor had announced were very positive. But then the criticism shifted, not from Germany is not doing anything, they're too slow, they're not lifting a finger for the Ukraine, even in the face of an aggression. It shifted to it's slow walking decisions, not implementing. It is not sending heavy weapons, it's only commitments, and they're not delivering. Well, my answer to that is if you look at the entirety of military, humanitarian, and civilian support and include what Germany is doing within the EU framework, we're actually the second single most important supporter of Ukraine. It's true that some of the military equipments came late. That's due to some logistical reasons, to training reasons. In some cases, it was known to the Ukrainian side that it would require time for the delivery, but the decision was all the same. We'll take that road. But all in all, we're sending the howitzers, as you mentioned, we're sending Gepards. We're going to send the MAS systems. We're going to send the IRIS-T, which are state-of-the-art weapon systems. We have been sending artillery and bunker-busting bombs and anti-aircraft tanks and anti-tank missiles. So the number and the relevance of the equipment we are sending is huge. I do agree, actually I don't agree, but I do state what is obvious, that in some cases it took time, but there's no doubt as regards the determination of Germany to support Ukraine in defending itself, and to do it as quickly and as massively as we possibly can.
And let's not also forget that on Germany's shoulders is the framework nation concept with NATO for responsibility for Lithuania. And of course, we just saw in the press yesterday and again today, Russia now accusing Lithuania of blockading, which isn't really accurate, but in any event, blockading shipments of goods through to Kaliningrad. And so that sort of begs the question there as well. So it's good that Germany is going to be spending all this money on the military equipment side, because clearly there's a lot of responsibility on its shoulders right now. So, but anyway.
We're also ramping up, as you pointed out, our presence in Lithuania, not only by setting up a leadership element for a brigade, but over time it will be a full-fledged brigade stationed there. And we hope that similar decisions can be taken with regard to Estonia and to Latvia by other NATO allies.
So let's go to the G7 now. How has all of this impacted the G7? Would you anticipate discussions about how to reach a resolution of this? We know Vladimir Putin isn't invited, and assume that Zelensky will be invited to address the member states. And I know for sure that it's the policy of the United States government that nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. So the idea of the G7 nations pressuring some kind of settlement is sort of, at least my view is, would not be on the table, although you may have some different information on that. But also just in terms of thinking through the economic challenges that Ukraine faces. I mean, it's got a $5 billion, we learned at the dinner at your residence with the Munich Security Conference, a $5 billion a month deficit now. And obviously hundreds of billions of dollars of a need to rebuild Ukraine over time. So, what do you think the impact of all this will be on the G7? How might it play out?
Russia's aggression against Ukraine has certainly upended our entire G7 presidency, which was slated to focus on climate change and biodiversity and environment and economic stability and transformation in the wake of COVID and health security and combating pandemic and resilience of democracies. Now, mind you, all of these issues remain incredibly important, but Ukraine has simply taken a center stage right now. It has shaped the German G7 presidency, and we've worked on different working strands on how to support Ukraine, that is on the sanctions working strand, on humanitarian help, on communication, on international law. As far as this the G7 meeting in Mao is concerned, the signal of support of the international Western community, of which the G7 is a nucleus, will be crucial, but that will not be sufficient. Also, the additional support for Ukraine will be taking a center stage in the declaration, including the financial support that Ukraine will receive. And I would remind you that since the beginning of this year, the G7, including the EU, has pledged nearly 20 billion US dollar as budgetary help for Ukraine. And I don't include in this the proposal of the EU Commission for additional macrofinance support of some 9 billion euros. That will also come on top of it. So the summit will actually focus massively on how to support Ukraine. Can I add another point, because it's linked?
Please.
We haven't talked about it as yet, but it's also linked to this Russian aggression in Ukraine. There are trickle effects which were intended of this war, and that is the looming international food security crisis.
And we've got a lot of questions on that, so just go right at it.
That is, looking back, you can follow decisions Russia has taken in autumn last year and even before the war, which are indicative of their looming intention to use the effects of the war in order to pressurize or weaponize, if you will, weaponize food security in order to pressurize countries that are utterly dependent on the delivery of fertilizers, the delivery of grains, the delivery of wheat from Ukraine and from Russia. It was part of their strategy. And that needs to be called, not only needs to be called out, because it happens because Russia wanted it. It happens because Russia is blockading the exports from Ukraine. It is because Russia is stealing grain from Ukrainian territory, as we know, and it is because Ukrainians are being prevented from working on their fields and from harvesting and sowing because of the war. So all of that is an effect of decisions Russia has taken and the war Russia is conducting. And we need to react to it. We need to react by saying who's responsible, but we also need to react by doing what we possibly can in order to alleviate or prevent the food security crisis. In the next days, the German foreign minister is going to convene a conference in Berlin on this very issue, inviting G7 foreign ministers and development ministers and ministers for agriculture. She will invite representatives from affected countries. She will invite relevant UN actors. She will invite civil society actors and philanthropists in order for all of us to join forces and to see what we can do in order to facilitate the food security situation. It also taps into the Global Alliance for Food Security that the World Bank, in alignment with the G7 country, has shaped a couple of months ago, also designed to take steps to avert hunger and to avert suffering in the countries that are affected by the secondary effects of Russia's aggression.
I think this is so important. And I mean, it's important for the global economy. It's important clearly from a humanitarian standpoint. It's important from the standpoint of immigration and refugees. And you load upon that the climate challenges that are now hitting agriculture literally everywhere in the world. Hugely important, and we've got to do everything we can to stop this weaponization of food. But what's happening is Vladimir Putin is running around to the global south saying, hey, oh, this is terrible. This is those sanctions. I'd get you the food tomorrow, but it's these sanctions that are preventing it. And, you know, let's not forget that nations representing a majority of the people who live on this planet did not vote to condemn this invasion and this Russian aggression and war crimes and all that at the UN. And I think there's a sense coming from the global south of almost a pox on both your houses. You know, we don't like what Russia's doing, but on the other hand, the West, you promised us vaccines, you didn't give them to us. You know, for years, you've been pillaging our raw materials and on and on. And I think there's a huge opportunity for us as the West to deliver something to the global south. But I think this has to absolutely rise to a top priority. And I'm glad to hear that it will be treated as such at the G7.
Can I respond to that too? You're right. We hear from countries from the global south that this is not our war, it's your war. You haven't reacted to our wars in the past, and all the charges you've mentioned before. But the fact remains that this is a war of aggression against the territorial integrity and the sovereignty of a country. It's also a war of aggression against a democracy, because that seems to have been one of the major threats considered by Russia as justification enough for an aggression. But a war of aggression against sovereignty and territorial integrity, surely for the majority of the countries across the world, constitutes a violation of international law that could affect them too. So allowing that would open wide a door that would make violations of territorial integrity justified by territorial claims a very existential and a threat looming large. And that's why 140 states, and in the first case, 141 states in the United Nations have actually condemned the Russian aggression. We need to return to that fundamental point. It was an aggression against international law, against territorial integrity, and against sovereignty. And therefore, it was an aggression against all of us. On food security, here again, what we need to say is Russia had planned for it. Russia had put caps on and restrictions on the export of grains and fertilizers as early as autumn last year, and has reiterated that even before the war. Russia, we know that, is stealing grains in Ukraine and transferring that to them to Crimea. Russia is preventing the export of grains from Ukraine. And so far, we haven't seen any progress in the talks with Russia that would facilitate exports in order to alleviate the food security crisis in Africa, in Latin America, and elsewhere.
Yeah, I guess Erdogan is somehow in discussions with Putin on this, but don't see any indication that that's gonna be going anywhere. Yeah, somebody wrote an interesting question. It's clear the G7 is united on all this, but what about when we get to the G20 in Indonesia this fall? There's the question of who gets invited. There's the question of do people walk out when Vladimir Putin presumably walks into that room. Maybe food security would be a great topic. I don't, Indonesia is hosting it, but I mean, maybe that would be a great topic to, sort of put on the table with that broader membership. But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's for the Indonesian presidency to shape the conditions and the choreography of the summit. It certainly will be very tricky. And I'm sure of one thing, and that is the isolation of Russia will become pretty visible to the global spectators. I would also point out that Indonesia is among the outreach guests of the G7 summit in Elmau, and will be part of discussions on a number of issues that will be relevant for the G20 as well. And it will also be part of a statement that the G7 are going to adopt on the resilience of democracies. As I see it, yes, the G20 will be very tricky, but the fact that countries like India and Indonesia and South Africa and Argentina and Senegal are part of the outreach group participating in the G7 summit.
That's good.
Now foreshadows a trajectory.
Oh, for sure. Oh, that's excellent. I've had a number of questions, not the overwhelming majority of them, but another questions have popped up in the chat what about the cost, to Germany or the West or Germany, I suppose, in particular, of isolating Russia? What are the long-term costs about that? What about NATO? Isn't this all really NATO's fault? I mean, it sounds like this is, Putin for Steyerland, but I just wanted to get your take on that side of the argument, which you do hear somewhat in Germany, and you also hear it on Fox News, interestingly enough, in the United States with Tucker Carlson. Why should we care about Ukraine? This is terrible for our energy prices. And honestly, you might hear it from the next president of the United States, should a certain person get elected president of the United States. So, I think it's important to sort of put those issues to bed and really make clear, about the important, and you've touched on this a lot, but I mean, the importance of sending this message that crime doesn't pay, as an example in terms of international affairs and why it's so important. But how do you respond to all of that?
First, it's true. It will exact a price, and it does already. We see it in the gasoline prices. We see it in inflation. We see it in the energy consumption prices in Germany, and that will not change overnight. It may even increase. It will trigger in the European case, and certainly in the German case, a full withdrawal and irreversible withdrawal from the dependence of Russian fossil fuels, much, much faster than anyone had expected before. We are returning to some to energies we hadn't thought like, for example, cold storage facilities that we hadn't thought or we would be using anytime soon, will certainly accelerate the transition to renewables, but that will go, at least for a smaller time, hand in hand with using transitional energies. But all of that decoupled from Russian fossil fuels. So that's crucial. Why would people be ready to pay the price? Because they see that a war actually happened, that it could happen. And allowing a country like Russia, which is the biggest country on earth, allowing Russia to get away with it without any severe consequences that, with hindsight, from the vantage point of a historian, will make those consider that the decision to go into war by Russia was a catastrophic one. If that doesn't happen, you open the door to a jungle-like behavior globally, and that is hugely dangerous. It's a case of if we don't stand our ground now, and if we don't do it collectively, and if we don't push back against it, and if we don't prevail in doing so, the world will have fundamentally altered, and in ways that will entail risks and threats and dangers that we even can't begin to see today. So it's my answer is what we do now counts, and it will be incredibly important for the security in the future. So looking at the short-term effects in terms of energy prices, important and painful as they may be, by the way, not nearly as painful as the terror that Ukraine is going through. If we don't take that into account, the world will become much, much more dangerous.
Well, and of course, that is a great entry point to a topic I told you I wanted to bring up, which is China. And there are really three elements of this. There's the Russia relationship with China, that the 5,000-word communique that was released after the confab between Putin and Xi Jinping on the eve of the Beijing Winter Olympics. So point number one, trying to, in effect, create a different world order, if you will. The second point being the implications of this war, and not just so much the war, but the way it's been conducted on China, both in terms of lessons that Xi Jinping may be taking away from it as he's considering things like Taiwan, but also in terms of their other geopolitical objectives, which gets to point number three, which is Europe, and particularly Germany, since we're talking about Germany here, Germany's relationship with China. China is Germany's largest trading partner. Some wags say that Germany had a great deal. You know, America would protect them. Russia would give them cheap energy, and they'd make this great stuff and sell it to China. And that I happen, you know, sure that this is hugely important. The economic and commercial relationship between Germany and China is very, very important. And just curious your thoughts about the implications of all of this, particularly in the context of what you just said on that topic as well. So, three-part question. You know, the you know, partnership for life without limits. Maybe there are limits. We're seeing implications of the war on that relationship, and then the German and European Chinese relationship.
Well, look, a couple of things. The first one is, let's compare what China, how China aligned itself with Russia with the way it acted after the Georgian War or after Crimea. And if you compare, you will easily conclude that Russia has aligned itself, that China has aligned itself to Russia in this war in ways completely different than in both previous occasions, where it kept a big and a significant distance. It did not now. China also endorsed the justification of the Russian aggression, placing the responsibility on the West and underscoring the relevance of influence spheres. That affects Europe, that affects European countries, and it affects European security. So it's important to watch that development. It's also important to watch how this is going to move on, because as we analyze situations, we tend to think that situations are very static and it will be a straight highway to a clear-cut destination. But there are smaller indications where China actually does still keep its distance, does not vote alongside Russia. It is certainly not backfilling in the sanctions sector. It is not circumventing sanctions, which is not to say that one day it may not, but for the moment, that's the analysis. And I suggest we analyze at every juncture as we move on and don't operate on yesterday's analysis or previous perceptions. The third observation is what you said is completely true. Our paradigm of interdependence, producing alignment, predictability, and being mutually advantageous, is being tested now in the Chinese context as well. And what we certainly should look at are all the areas that are related to sensitive ecosystems, by which I mean will produce political and other vulnerability or economic vulnerabilities in the case of political weaponization. We cannot unlearn the lesson we've taken away from Russia, and that will have to be factored in as we go forward and shape interdependence, or the shape of interdependence with China too. That will be a process, and in this process, we'll have to carefully watch how China acts, how China interacts with Russia, how China aligns itself with Russian objectives and with Russian political premises. Now, a final word on that. I don't think that Ukraine and the Russian war in Ukraine is necessarily considered by China as a template for what it will or will not do with regard to China, with Taiwan, for the simple reason that from the Chinese vantage point, Taiwan is part of China,
right,
whereas Ukraine has never been part of Russia, so it's neither here nor there. But what they will carefully look out for is what worked internationally for Russia. What sanctions did work? Where are the vulnerabilities among those countries who adopt sanctions? What were the areas of circumvention? It's a whole playbook is now emerging, and we're still at the beginning of it, that will certainly inform Chinese tactical decisions. So here again, my response to you is let's not compartmentalize. Let's look at the entire picture. Let's look at the long-term costs of decisions we take today. We have learned a lot about vulnerabilities, not only during this war, but also during the COVID era. All of that needs to come into our cost-benefit analysis. Whilst knowing that cost-benefit analysis do not necessarily correlate with those that you interact with.
Oh, sorry, excuse me. Well, you know, I think when you think about and I love the way you frame it in terms of the analysis that China undoubtedly is going through right now about vulnerabilities and what sanctions work, don't work. One thing they're probably looking at is where would effective counter sanctions or counter moves be country by country. And I think a lot of folks have expressed surprise. I know I certainly was surprised that Putin didn't cut off the gas to Germany and Europe more quickly. He's now kind of slowly walking it down, but that would have been so devastating. But I guess, and you alluded to this earlier, that Russia's always had this sense of wanting to be the provider of energy to Europe no matter what. And as you mentioned, during the Georgia conflict in Chechnya and even the first Ukraine situation, and even today, the gas is still coming from Ukraine and Russia's still paying the transit fees. So just be curious about your thoughts on that, and is it coming? And if it is coming, particularly with the winter approaching in a few months, if it is coming, how well prepared do you see Germany being right now? Those regasification plants have not been completed. I was shocked when I heard that they were stopped construction in 2018. I'd been told earlier that had been started. That was one of the ways of guaranteeing some diversification of energy sources. But in any event, just your thoughts on that.
Well, among the key pillars that have been shattered as holy cows, as you called them, after the beginning of the war, was the assumption that Russia was a reliable supplier of energy. Russia's export case always rested on that. That's over. That's my first point. My second point is, as the war goes on, and as we take decisions in Europe and in Germany to withdraw from Russian fossil fuels, Russia will lose a leverage. And as it loses leverage, the tendency to be the one that actually dictates the movement and takes proactive measures will probably rise. How are we prepared for that? Well, at the outbreak of the war, 55% of our gas came from Russia, 35% of our coal came from Russia, and 50% of our coal came from Russia. Now, oil is at about 12%. Coal is very near, it's under 8%. It will be 0 by August. And oil is, or was at least a couple of days ago, at 35%.
That's gas. Gas is
gas. I'm sorry, gas. I meant gas. But you will have heard that Russia has reduced the transit via Nord Stream 1, so that is also having an effect. We'll be moving out of fossil fuels much faster than anyone would have assumed possible. And that will affect the Russian calculus too, to the degree that we take less and less from them. They will try to inflict greater pain on us. I think part of the Nord Stream 1 decision belongs into that picture.
Yeah. Well, Ambassador Haber, liebe Emily, it is, as always, just so wonderful. And we're getting lots of comments from the almost 200 people who tuned into this, about how refreshing it is to hear just your thoughtful, candid, direct assessment of this situation that I think so many people are trying to get their heads around. And just in particular, the frames with it, your perspective and your experience allow you to look at this and share what is happening with us in a way that, maybe we haven't thought about before. So I just want to thank you so much for joining us. Maybe we can, in the fall, we can do a reprise, or in the summer after all these summits, we'll figure that out. But I just want to thank you so much for being with us, for always being so supportive of the American Council on Germany. And also want to, before giving you the last word, thank all of our guests and participants and the organizers for putting this together. So over to you.
Thank you, John. It's always great to discuss with you. I could have continued for hours because there's so much to talk to and there's so much to look into, you see, from different vantage points, because we are talking about, we are, I believe, and that will be my final word, we've seen the end of an era. And I don't know what the name of the new era that we are entering just now will be. But I really know this, that the way we prevail together, the way we manage transatlantic unity, the way we manage to confront this terrible war and the long-term effects will probably give the name to the new era that we're entering in right now. And that's why it's so hugely important that our alliance and alignment management is center stage and holds.
Well, thank you so much for that important closing thought. And you have a good rest of the week. I know you're going to have a little bit of a holiday coming up, well deserved. You haven't had one in a year, so enjoy that, and we'll be back at you. Take care. Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.